high school, so I had quite a few colleges that I could have gone to, and I told my our guidance counselor that I was going to go to the University of Idaho, and he said, "Why?" And I said, gave the spiel about they have one of the best college of natural resources, wildlife management, and fisheries programs anywhere in the nation, which is true, but I wasn't being honest. That wasn't why I was going to the University of Idaho. It was so that I could chase salmon and steelhead on Saturdays and Sundays, and really way too many Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So I don't see any of my old professors in here. They probably understood that by my attendance. So we'll get into a little bit of what salmon and steelhead mean for Idaho. So Idaho was once the greatest salmon factory, Chinook salmon factory, anywhere on Earth. I mean, we accounted for roughly 60% of all of the Chinook that went in through the Columbia system, some years as high as 65 to 70%. So we had huge historical runs that used to come back to Idaho. 4 to 7 million salmon and steelhead returning to Idaho. I mean, if you can imagine going up to the Stanley Basin and seeing, I think they had somewhere right around 180,000 fish that used to come back to the Stanley Basin. Just incredible. We've heard stories about biologists and whatnot, fishermen that said they could run across the Salmon River on the backs of salmon, and they swear that it's not hyperbole. But I'll start it off just with this quote. It's a Steve Licatowicz quote, for those that haven't read any of his stuff. Tremendous biologist, an advocate for salmon recovery. For millions of years, salmon have accumulated the history of the species and retained it in the gene pools of individuals and populations. As a result, the salmon's genetic program, coded in its DNA, is a textbook containing thousands of years of evolutionary experience. Lessons on how to survive in a harsh, changing world. The reason that I chose this quote, not only is it just a great, more eloquent than anything I could put to paper, but it's really important because this puts what we're talking about into context. Salmon have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. Actually, we're going on millennia for salmon. They've survived almost everything that you can think of. They've gone through ice ages. They've gone through warming climates. They've gone through ocean conditions that are horrible, hotter than we can ever think about, although we probably should start thinking about that. But what they haven't been able to evolve with is a system of dams blocking their river. So the great thing about salmon, Idaho salmon, they're unlike any other salmon anywhere in the entire world. They're the only fish that travel 900 miles to the ocean and back, and the only fish that climb 7,000 feet in elevation. Only run anywhere in the entire world. Not only is that important because it makes them really cool, we call them marathoners and mountaineers, but it's incredibly important in the context of climate change because Idaho salmon and steelhead are the only salmon and steelhead that spawn at elevations high enough to be buffered from the effects of climate change. So when we start talking about having to recover salmon in the face of a warming climate, it's Idaho salmon that are going to be the key to being able to repopulate those. So let's do our best to save them now. So what the heck happened? Why are we not seeing 4 to 7 million fish coming back? Well, it started in 1955 with the construction of Ice Harbor Dam. Moving on, 1961, beginning of Lower Monumental. 1963, construction of Little Goose. And then culminating in 1975 with the completion of Lower Granite Dam.
Is that all in Idaho?
So not the crux of saving Idaho salmon happens in Washington. So everything that we can do in Idaho, and I'm a longtime TU member, current member, and I will say that part of what makes me proud about being a TU member is some of the great work, habitat work that's happened throughout the state of Idaho, especially in the Lemhi Basin. We have the best habitat anywhere in North America for salmon and steelhead, between the Middle Fork, the wilderness areas, the Maine salmon, and all of these recovered areas in the Lemhi. We've done all that we can to restore salmon in Idaho that we can do in the state. So what we have to do now is remove 4 dams that happen to fall on the lower Snake River in Washington. So a little history about salmon. Salmon are anadromous fish. Anadromous means that they're born in fresh water. They live here for 1 to 2 years, migrate out, go through a metamorphosis, live in the ocean for 1 to 4 years, and then return back to their natal waters to spawn. The really cool thing about salmon, though, as smolts, when they go out to the ocean, they don't actually swim out to the ocean. They're swept by the current. So they're going all the way from Idaho out to the Pacific Ocean, tail first, nose upstream, which is really cool, but it's also incredibly important because they're also echolocating the entire way back. So they can tell different drainages. Chinook are so incredible that they can actually go back to the same riffle that they were born in. That's how incredible these fish really are. So how far do our fish go? I mentioned that they go 900 miles out to the Pacific, but once they're there, I mean, that's when their journey really begins. We've had Idaho fish that have been tagged all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska, had Idaho fish that were caught off the coast of Japan and Kamchatka, and all the way down to like the mouth of the Sacramento. So our fish are all over the Pacific Ocean. It's incredible. So Idaho's remaining anadromous fish. Well, we have 3 that we talk about now. We have sockeye salmon, we have Chinook salmon, and we have steelhead. We once had a 4th species, but that one ecologically is extinct. We do have hatchery fish that return, and that'd be coho salmon that come back to Idaho. But ecologically, we don't have, our wild run of coho are extinct. What do salmon mean to people? Well, they mean a lot. Idaho itself was built on the premise of salmon. We have the Salmon River, we have Salmon, Idaho. It's ingrained in the DNA of the state. But long before we were ever a state, the reason that people came here and stayed here were salmon. We have the Nez Perce tribe who called themselves the Salmon people. We have the Shoshone-Bannock, all of the upper Snake River tribes and the Columbia River fisheries tribes. They all came to Idaho and would fish, and they're vitally important to the culture of those people. But what's really incredible is we also now have some evidence that the first people that ever came to North America actually came to Idaho, so at Cooper's Landing on the Salmon River. We have the oldest remnants now of habitation by people anywhere in North America. So we now have a new theory that people came down the Columbia and stayed in Idaho for the first people to populate North America. And the reason that they believe they stayed here was salmon. So what do salmon mean ecologically? Well, they're a keystone species, and I know that term gets thrown about quite a bit, but salmon really are the apex of what it means to be a keystone species. They don't just affect the river. They affect everything, whether it's eagles, osprey, bears, but there's so much more than that. You actually can find salmon DNA that's ingrained in the tree rings of the whitebark pines at the top of the sawtooths. So you get marine-derived nutrients that actually make their entire way up the mountain column and are incredibly important to the overall health of a forest ecosystem. A lot of studies have started to come out about climate resiliency of our forests, and having a dearth of marine-derived nutrients is one of the reasons that they're a lot more susceptible to whether it's bark beetle or just catastrophic wildfire. So I'm not purporting that bringing salmon back is going to stop large-scale wildfires, but I can say the science says that it will ameliorate those concerns. If we look outside of Idaho, so if we look at this population, the southern resident killer whales, 95% of their diet consists of Chinook salmon. And of that 95%, they conclude that it's right around 80% of those salmon are coming from Idaho. So our salmon are the key to recovering and sustaining the population of southern resident killer whales. All right, where are we at currently? So we talked about 4 to 7 million at one point. So at Idaho Rivers United, and those who don't know who Idaho Rivers United is, John's going to yell at me for not starting with this. We're Idaho's largest statewide river-focused conservation organization. We've been around for 32 years, and for 31 of those 32 years, salmon steelhead has been one of our key conservation priorities. So with our science that we help disseminate, we focus on wild salmon returns. I'll give you the hatchery numbers included on the far right, but when we talk about recovering a species, it has to be the wild numbers that are coming back. When we talk about 4 to 7 million coming back, those were wild salmon. We have a threshold now for Chinook salmon of 127,000 fish back to Idaho. That has to be 127,000 wild fish back to Idaho. Where are we? So as you can see in these, this column right here, the last 5 years, I mean, it's been a real disappointing run for Chinook salmon. Last year we had a lot of reports about it being a banner year for salmon. We had some of the best ocean conditions that we've ever seen. We had water availability. We had this perfect storm, and yet we only saw 16,462 wild Chinook salmon come back to Idaho. Even if we included the inflated numbers with hatchery fish, we were only at 71,000. So we were barely over halfway to the recovery goal if we included hatchery fish. But focusing just on wild fish, I mean, we're about 1/10 of the way there in what was considered a banner year. The important thing also when we look at this is not just to look at the numbers that we have, but where is the trend line going? So we see these spikes that, like I talked about last year being a banner year, we had perfect storm of great conditions. Even with all of those, the trend line, the trajectory that these fish are on is still heading toward extinction. And that's a scary proposition. These X's right here, those are the 4 dams that we talked about, 1975 with Lower Granite being completed. And you can see right there, I mean, if that was an EKG, talking about paramedics, they'd be concerned. Steelhead. I mean, we've had some bigger fluctuations with steelhead, but same trend line, same numbers that we're looking at for steelhead. We have a recovery goal of 104,000 steelhead back to Idaho. Last year, again, banner year, we had less than 20,000 wild steelhead make it back to Idaho. And then lastly, sockeye. Sockeye are a little bit of a different story because they were actually extirpated from Idaho. There was, we'll just call it misguided management of the fisheries resource in the Sawtooth Valley back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where other sport fish were prized and prioritized over salmon or over sockeye. So a lot of the high mountain lakes where sockeye used to come back were poisoned and eradicated from their traditional habitat, including all the way down to Redfish Lake. But through the efforts of particularly with sockeye, the Shoshone-Bannock Tribe's Fisheries Department, we have sockeye that we can continue to fight for. However, we have a recovery goal of about 9,500 sockeye coming back. Last year we had 46. They talk about that being one of the best years to see sockeye back at Redfish Lake. I mean, when we're celebrating 46 fish coming back to Idaho, there's something wrong with that. So what does all of this really mean, though? How do we get somewhere? How do we measure if we're making an impact or whatnot? The way that we do that, it's a small to adult ratio, which is a fancy term for the recruitment rate of juvenile salmon returning back as adults. For a sustainable fishery, we have to have a 2% smolt to adult return ratio, which means for every 100 fish that go out to the ocean, we need 2 of them to return back. For an expanding population, we need 4 to 6%. These are actually a little bit old numbers because I went off of the 2021 numbers when I first made this. We're now at 0.6% smolt to adult recruitment for Chinook, and we're at 0.9% for Steelhead. So well on our way to extinction. According to the Nez Perce Fisheries Department, which is one of the best fisheries departments in the entire world, they did a very robust study of all of the tributary systems throughout the Salmon River and Snake River drainages. And nearly 50% of tributary populations are already at the quasi-extinction threshold, which means that there are fish in there, but ecologically it's insignificant to recover those strains already. And this is actually a snapshot of that survey. So if you look at someplace like a Soton Creek, these are how many spawning pairs have been observed in some of these creeks. So a Soton Creek, basically they're extirpated in the last few years. If you look at someplace like the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River, which there's a giant proposed mine at the headwaters of, but we won't get into that today. But still, some of the most incredible and important Chinook, especially spring-summer Chinook habitat anywhere in the world. I mean, we're looking close to 75 spawning pairs in a drainage as incredible as that. All right, so why do we have these dams? So there are some services that the lower Snake River dams provide, and this is I guess to go back to a boater, if we were in the crux of the rapid, this is what we have to navigate to get through this now. So the services the lower 4 Snake River dams provide, their grain transport, their hydropower production, and their irrigation to central Washington. You might hear reports about all the flood control that they do. They're actually run-of-river dams. They provide zero flood control. They provide zero storage. So these are the 3 services that we have to be able to replace if we're going to recover our salmon and steelhead. So when we look at transportation, how much grain, where it's going, one thing that I'll have you notice on this, and I wish I'd have got one that went back even further, but you can notice from 1999 the amount of wheat that's actually being sent via barge anymore. The farmers are actually abandoning it and moving to rail on their own, which is the most viable and economical alternative to barging down the lower Snake. But we still average about 2.4 million tons. Starting in 2020, that number has gone down a little bit, but I don't have the up-to-date figure. But even if we put it at 2.4 million tons, it's down about 40% in the last 15 years. So,
which sounds like a lot, but I think it equates out to about 17 barge trips from Lewiston out.
It does. And the barges are huge. So the number of rail cars per barge is rather large. However, what we're going to talk about right here, so one of the things that that you hear quite a bit when they talk about moving away from barge to rail is the carbon footprint. And there's competing studies out there that talk about which ones actually has a higher carbon footprint, whether it's the barge or rail. It's pretty much neck and neck, with the exception of this. So if you look at the percentage of electrified railways worldwide, I mean, you have places like Italy that have 64% of their railways are electrified. You have places like China, which has a huge rail infrastructure. 41% of those And then there's us in the US at 1%. I can't say that we're 1% though and growing, so we have nowhere to go up from there. But we do have a real opportunity to reinvest in the way that we're utilizing rail, especially in the Pacific Northwest, at this moment in time. If we're going to replace the lower Snake River dams and have to rebuild some of this short-term rail, we can do it this way. In fact, one of the more promising engineering feats actually goes out of the Camas Prairie. So from Grangeville, they have the potential for regenerative transportation there. So you have to come up the Winchester grade, which is a pretty significant grade for any train. But it's going up that grade empty. Gets filled up in Grangeville with all of the grain from the Camas Prairie, and then it goes back down the Winchester grade fully loaded. And so the potential to actually have a net positive for electrical generation is there for some of the farmers on the Camas Prairie. So we have not only the opportunity to eliminate, well, I shouldn't say eliminate, but minimize our carbon footprint from the Camas Prairie, because right now they have to send all of that via semi down to Lewiston, to the port of Lewiston. But we also have the opportunity to minimize shipping costs now for those farmers on the Camas Prairie. Because if we're able to generate a net positive in electricity, it's a whole lot less expensive than shipping it via big rig and diesel. So, kind of going quickly on all of this. Anybody have questions? So the next piece, when we talk about energy production. So the lower Snake River dams have a nameplate capacity of 3,200 megawatts of generation. That means if conditions were ripe, so if we had high water running 12 months out of the year, 7 days a week, they could make 3,200 megawatts. Obviously, that's not the case. So each year, on average, they average 963 megawatts of generation, which isn't an insignificant amount, but it's easily replaceable by solar, by wind, especially when you look at solar and wind that are paired with the advancements in battery storage technology. So we have the ability now to replace 3,200 megawatts with generation of 3,200 megawatts instead of the 963 that it's actually producing. The other downside, and what this graph actually shows, is with the lower Snake River dams, they're providing 963 megawatts of energy, but the peaks when we need it the most, which are July, August, September, and then again December, January, and February. So when it's really hot and really cold, those are also the times when the river is running the lowest. And so the availability for power generation isn't there when we need it the most. With the exception of last year, we've been in what's being called a prolonged drought. I hate that term because drought implies that it's an anomaly. I do believe that we need to stop calling it that. We're in a new water era where water availability isn't what it used to be. And the amount of water that's available for the lower Snake River dams is going to continue to diminish every year in the face of a changing climate. And then lastly, when they talk about hydropower, the other thing that we hear quite often, not quite often, every time they talk about hydropower, is this carbon-free clean energy that it produces, which is categorically untrue. There's a wealth of science that showcases the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are attributed to a hydropower system. And there's 4 ways that a hydropower system creates greenhouse gases. One is decomposition of inundated organic material. So when it's first flooded, all of the the area that a newly formed reservoir is inundating is now going through decomp. The next way that it does it is through degassing. So when you take anoxic cold water from the bottom of a reservoir and pass it through the turbines, it releases large amounts of methane. And methane being a greenhouse gas that is 81 times more potent than carbon dioxide. The next two ways are ebullition, which is the bubbling of methane or carbon dioxide to the surface and released into the atmosphere. And the last one is diffusion. So diffusion, when there's a drawdown from any reservoir, you now have a higher concentration of greenhouse gases in the reservoir than you do into the surrounding atmosphere. And to get to equilibrium, it diffuses gases up into the atmosphere. What's really interesting about this, and I won't go into it too terribly much here, but if anybody's interested, I'll go on for hours on it. The amount of greenhouse gases that are generated from some of these projects are on par or exceed those of some of the coal-fired power plants that they're replacing, which when those analyses have been done, it's mind-blowing. And the tool that we use to analyze that, it's called the GRES tool. What the acronym stands for, I can't remember. But it was developed by the Hydropower Reform Coalition, which IRU is a founding member of, but in concert with the International Hydropower Association. So this was partly a byproduct of the industry itself, because there is, by some of the groups within the hydropower industry, a very concerted effort to understand the effects that the hydro system is having on climate and climate change. Any questions there? So what does recovery look like? Well, we talked about it a little bit. So replacing energy production with renewables. Right now there are RFPs out that total somewhere around 12,000 megawatts of production that could be going to shovel-ready projects in the Pacific Northwest right now. We have some really cool ones that are already underway. When you look at the Nez Perce Solar Initiative, they're going to be generating roughly 500 megawatts from the solar arrays that they're putting on the reservation up by Lapaway, as well as the Columbia River Vision Study, which is a byproduct of the Yakima and the Lummi tribes. And they've got a plan that encompasses both solar and wind, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,700 megawatts of energy. So really just those two projects alone equal 3,200, which is the max capacity that the Lower Snake River dams could produce. Again, getting back to modern freight transport, really looking at electric rail technology. There is a new electric freight rail system that's just been implemented in Pennsylvania. And so there is now precedent in the United States for using freight rail that's been electrified. And then lastly, the one that's the most easily solvable of all of the pieces, there are about 32,000 acres of farmland that is irrigated from the Lower Snake River dams. Those can still be irrigated if we take the dams out. Basically just drop the straws and they can continue to irrigate there. Having said all that, what is the price tag of all of that? Well, if you look at the study done by Mike Simpson, it's $21 billion. If you look at the study that was done by Patty Murray, it ranges anywhere from $19 billion to $32 billion. So a huge price tag. However, in the last 20 years, the Bonneville Power Administration has spent $28 billion on fish recovery programs right now. And we're closer to extinction than we've ever been. So really, say we went to the top of Patty Murray's expectations and we spent $32 billion. That's money well spent because we're going to continue spending another $28 billion in the next 2 years, just flailing away, tilting at windmills, if you will. will it work? Because that's the one thing that a lot of people have latched onto, that Mike Simpson, when he made his proposal, was, I don't know that this will work. He perhaps was being a little bit too genuine, but we do know that this will work. And why do we know it? Because the science tells us that it'll work. Not only the science tells us that it'll work, but it's worked every single time that we've removed a dam. So these are just 4 of the examples of the 200 dams that have been removed in the United States. All 200 dams have seen an uptick in fish habitat and fish numbers. But these 4 in particular, the Elwha River, which just came out somewhat recently, but they're decades ahead of where their modeling said they would be for salmon recovery. They now have over 8,000 Chinook that are returning to the Elwha system, when they used to have right around 65. We look at the Kennebec rivers. They had a population of alewives, which are a herring, I believe, but still an anadromous fish. It was an extinct population on the Kennebec River. When they took out the Kennebec Dam, they didn't think that they were going to recover these alewives, but they did it anyway. They now have 5.5 million alewives in Kennebec. The Penobscot, they did a bypass around one of the dams on the Penobscot, and now they have an anadromous population of Atlantic salmon from 2331 in 2009. Well, not just Atlantic salmon, but anadromous fish. Still, 2,000 fish to 2.1 million fish there. And then the White Salmon River, extinct populations of Chinook and Coho are now found in every single historical tributary that they used to be found in on the White Salmon River. So dam removal works. We know that it works because the science says that it does, but also we can see it firsthand that it works every single time. And this will be the last slide that I'll show you tonight, but how do we know that it's actually the lower Snake River dams that are doing this and not some other factor? You know, you're going to hear that there's pinniped predation, that it's horrible ocean conditions. Those are true. The ocean conditions are not great, and there are a large number of predators that are waiting to eat our smolts on their way out. However, what we can do is look in system and see if it's the same across the entire thing. So we talked about smolt to adult returns and needing at least a 2% to be a sustainable fishery. So we have numbers that come from the John Day system, the Yakima system, and then the Snake River system. All of these fish go past the 4 dams on the Columbia, with the exception of the John Day. They go through 3 dams on the Columbia. They go past the same predators. They go out to the same crappy ocean. They spend years out fending off predators in the ocean, coming back up, and they pass the same 3 to 4 dams on the way up. If you look at the John Day, we've got 3.5%, so a 3.5% smolt to adult return. If we look at the Yakima for Chinook, we have 2.4%. If we look at the Snake River, like I said, we're down below 0.7% now. All of the other variables are the same, with the exception of 2. One being that we have to go past 4 more dams to get our fish home. And the second variable is we have the highest quality habitat anywhere in North America. So these fish that go to the John Day and the Yakima are going to degraded habitat that doesn't even compare to that in the wilderness or in the Lemhi of Idaho. So with that, we know that this will work. Do you all have any questions?
Yeah, when you're looking at the cost of taking out the dams and all of that, what is it gonna cost to keep the dams running? Because I think that a lot of those, aren't they coming up for having to be researched?
So
Can you speak to that?
the difference with the lower Snake River dams they're federal dams themselves, so they don't come up for relicensing like you will for the Hell's Canyon complex. They don't have to go through a FERC process. So they are exempt from that. So they don't have to go through any of that process. What they do have to go through, though, is congressional authorization. So Congress is the entity that will either have to decommission the dams or continue appropriating funds to keep them running. The other thing to consider with the lower Snake River dams is you don't actually have to breach the dams physically. The concrete structures can stay in place. There's an earthen berm that's about 2/3 of the diameter of the river. That's what actually just has to be removed. So say we did all of this and somehow this is the first time that dam removal didn't work and salmon don't come back. The dam structures are still there and we can rebuild the dang things if we needed to, but that won't happen because it's never happened in history that it didn't work. Did that answer the question?
No, sorry, thanks.
And in response to that, right now BPA is pretty well run out of all of the rainy day funds.
So
Of 700.
yes and no. So BPA has a few different funding streams. It's a bit of an anomaly in they're an entity that controls both the generation as well as the transmission. And so they have pools of funding that come in both for what they produce as well as what they sell and send out. Last year, for the first time, they actually had a reserve of around $100 million of excess funding that they were able to put back out.
To put back into their, for turbine replacement and.
No, they gave almost all of that back to customers as a type of a rebate. So you all may not have seen, but I think in Idaho we averaged somewhere around $1 rebate if you were on BPA.
But isn't BPA's largest customer California? And their cost per kilowatt?
BPA's largest customer is Seattle. So Seattle City and Light.
Well, that's Seattle City Light, that's Skagit, but.
Yeah.
But
That'd be-
BPA's, I believe, the biggest customer is California, that's using more liquefied natural gas, cheaper than what they can generate and transmit.
Well, so there was some truth to that at one point. California was a huge buyer of hydropower, especially from BPA. When they redid their last, I can't remember what the heck they termed it, but basically when they did the allocation of what percentage had to be renewables when they made their 100% commitment, they phased out how much of that could actually come from hydro system. And so the amount of availability to be able to count toward being clean energy from a hydro system is on a diminishing curve from California. So that the incentive to buy hydropower, so the incentive to buy from BPA is dwindling. Does that answer that question? Or is that clear as mud?
Clear as mud, I mean, no, but it makes sense.
Hydropower is no longer the darling of renewables that it once was in terms of
cheap energy.
the cheapest energy. Yeah, that's a very closely held thing in the Pacific Northwest that was true 30 years ago, but no longer. Hold on. You had yours up for
So given all these facts, why is there such a strong opposition towards the removal?
So there's two things that are really at play there. The first and foremost, most important one are the grain growers. The amount of subsidy that they get for shipping via barge is it's the largest government subsidized program for the entire agricultural industry. It's about 95% of that cost is being subsidized. So
Why was that?
Strips.
what's that?
Wow.
Down. Tidewaters and then Crowley and everybody's out.
I'm trying to find the proper way of not sounding condescending on it, but in part because agriculture historically was very hard. When some of that subsidy was first put into place, it was when the majority of the Palouse in central Washington was owned by family farms. And so the ability to actually run a farm, the margins were quite small. Now between North Idaho and Central Washington, there's about 8 landowners that own almost all of that. But they continue to get the subsidy that made it tenable for the mom and pop farmer to be able to do that. And so, yeah, that's the biggest obstacle, is getting the Grain Growers Association and the Farm Bureau on board with this, which there is potential. You know, in Congressman Simpson's plan, he allocated an endowment fund of $500 million to be able to continue that subsidy in perpetuity. So he made a promise that the amount that they were paying right now would never go up in perpetuity because this endowment would always be there, which is a great novel approach. You know, I think the reason that it didn't get the buy-in from the ag community was because it was a proposal and there weren't actual allocated funds to it. So the congressman comes to you and says, I'm going to give you $500 million, you got to trust me. I understand their reticence to just taking it at face value. But if he actually has the check and says, is the $500 million, that's a bit different. And second is the PUDs. A lot of them are still very reticent to changing away from hydro, and for the reason that we just talked about, because there's this closely held belief. I mean, it feels ingrained in the Pacific Northwest that our energy comes from hydro. Our hydro is clean. Our hydro is cheap, and customers don't want to see that changed. There's a real fear among them that power prices would skyrocket. The other thing that you'll hear a lot is that hydropower provides grid stability, because you do have these reservoirs behind it, and so you can start pushing water through if there's an emergency.
Yeah.
That's becoming less of an issue with the advancements in battery storage technology. In fact, battery storage technology at this point has probably surpassed that, considering when we need energy, the dams just don't have the water for it to store now. One here, and then I'll go over here.
5%.
I've always wondered about dam breakage, because I've always wondered, okay, today there's a lake. Tomorrow we open the valves and the lake goes away. What becomes of what was the lake bottom that is now exposed land, and how do we take care of that?
So a few different things. You know, first of all, rivers, much like the fish that are in them, are incredible living things, and they'll recover on their own pretty darn quickly. However, when you look at something like removal of 4 large dams on the Lower Snake River, you're not going to do that all at the same time. So what would happen is you would remove Lower Granite Dam first, so the uppermost one, and then potentially a year and a half later, you'd remove the next one, so that sediment starts moving down naturally and doesn't really get completely entrained at one single dam. There also would have to be some dredging that would go along with removal of some of the sedimentation from that. But again, being run-of-river dams, there's not going to be a huge amount like you would say if you took out the Hell's Canyon complex and were draining Brownlee, which I'm not advocating for that, just in case. But yeah, it's much less of an issue. The other thing that we have going for us right now is we're right at the beginning stages of the largest dam removal process in the history of the United States, with 4 large dams being removed on the Klamath. So we have a great case study to learn from, you know, what's going on there as well. So the plan, basically getting back to it, remove the uppermost dam, remove the next one, and then the last year it could be both of them in the same year, but probably one per year.
The whole of the land that was underwater is now exposed, and what's it look like? How do we take care of it?
So initially it's going to look like a big mud farm. However, by what we've seen with other large dam removals is that within a couple of years, it really starts, the regrowth process really starts on its own. It's kind of like when you have a forest fire that comes through here. I mean, within a year, you have incredible bunch grasses and wildflowers that have come up all of their own accord. However, we would have a lot of allocated funds to restoration efforts. So we would have seedling planting, some base area stabilization, things like that would go along.
So excellent presentation. Thank you very much. It seems you hit on the financial aspects of it, which is not trivial, but it seems like other barriers exist, like political will, public opinion, education. I don't think there's anybody in this room that would disagree with the facts or want to rip them out tomorrow. But like, where are we with getting the political will and the public opinion on board with this? Because that seems like one of the major obstacles as well.
So it's the major obstacle at this point. If you, in all of the surveys that have been done, and it doesn't matter if it's been done by, the PUDs and whatnot, overarching public sentiment is there for salmon recovery. It's somewhere in the realm of 70% at the low side for some of the studies that we've seen, all the way up to 90% of people in the Pacific Northwest are on board with salmon recovery. Now the caveat is, how do we get to salmon recovery? Breaching of the dams is still an overwhelming supported idea on an individual basis. However, you talked about a couple of things. The political will. I think that part of the issue is the polarization of our political system right now is such that it's tough to get buy-in from both sides, regardless of what the issue is, regardless of how much their constituents want it. And so we are starting to see a little bit of that chipping away. In fact, this whole notion was brought about by an Idaho Republican. So, this is an issue that already has bipartisan support. It has bicameral support because it's got support from Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the issue. The biggest things that need to happen, number one, is a bill needs to get introduced. Somebody just has to have the backbone to actually introduce a bill, and we'll see. I think that's coming. But the most important piece is to provide cover for them to be able to do this. So when I talked about the replacement services, and we have shovel-ready projects that can total 12,000 megawatts of energy, if we get those started now and have those in progress, if we start allocating money toward rebuilding the short line rail throughout North Washington and Idaho, then it's a lot easier for somebody like Mike Crapo to be able to say, you know what, I can be on board with this now because we actually have this infrastructure going on in North Idaho. We have the investments that are happening in this. It's not going to cripple our economy like what they say right now. So that's the crux of where we're at. And what I would say to how do we get there, that's where you all come in. And we're at the most important point of having your voices heard in letting people know, like Mike Crapo know, letting Jim Risch know. You can write Russ Fulcher. But letting them know that you're supportive of allocations to rebuild the short line, that you want to see responsibly sited renewable energy happening in Idaho, that you want to see these replacement services happening irrespective of whether or not it's in the context of dam breach. You just want to see these because it's beneficial for Idaho. And then once those are in place, then they have the cover to be able to say, we can now authorize dam breach. One thing I didn't talk about in here So the ag community, the amount of money that is shipped out, that is generated through the wheat that's shipped out of the Pacific Northwest in Idaho, is right around $570 million. The value of a recovered salmon population and salmon fishery in Idaho, when you start allocating not just the cost for guides and outfitters, but also the snowball effect with restaurants, hotel stays, all the rest of the ancillary economic generation. It's $512 million from the last study that we saw on the low end. So they're pretty darn comparable. The other thing is they're not mutually exclusive. We can have this $570 million ag economy, ship it out via rail, and have this $500 million fishing outdoor recreation economy coming back to Idaho. So that's the other point that we need to start really emphasizing to our elected officials, is that we're leaving $500 million on the table of economic generation. We're talking about places like Stanley's not, I wouldn't call that one of the depressed ones, but you drive through Riggins and the hotels are empty. Half the houses are for sale. You could buy a fishing outfit there for, pennies on the dollar. So we have a lot of these towns like Riggins, Idaho, salmon to a lesser extent. They've got a great recreation economy, but the amount of generation they could be bringing in from a fisheries economy is just astounding. So, sorry, I went off on a tangent there. But
Nick, can you speak to the new presidential memorandum? You might not be able, I know it's new.
I can, to as much of an extent as I am legally able to, because we are, as Idaho Rivers United, we are party to a 24-year lawsuit to recover salmon and steelhead against the Bonneville Power Administration and the Army Corps. So the latest presidential memorandum was hugely significant because it's the first time we've had a sitting president that has directed all of his agencies to prioritize salmon and steelhead recovery in terms of their operations and their fiscal fiduciary responsibilities. So what that really means is that Bonneville Power Administration can no longer put fish and wildlife on the back burner. They have to start addressing fish and wildlife, whether it's through funding, increasing their funding, or operations, which means increased spill. It means tackling temperature issues throughout the lower Snake River, things like that.
Okay, any other questions? Go ahead.
Are we good? All right, Nick, thank you very much for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Next month, this year, the way the schedule worked out, we are on the first Wednesday of every